here.
Seattle Children's wants every child to live the healthiest and most fulfilling life possible. That includes making sure children and teens are protected from COVID-19. COVID-19 vaccines are safe and will help protect your child from illness and hospitalization. This isn't about beating the odds, it's about changing them for all kidkind. Get your child vaccinated today.
Good afternoon. Wow, the sun is shining through in Seattle, and I am exceptionally excited to be here today. I am the CEO and publisher of ParentMap, and I am just thrilled that we've been able to put together a consortium of some of the best parenting media in the country, from Chicago Parent, Metro Family in Detroit, New York Family, and New Jersey Family, to bring you our 22-23 Parent Ed series. Thank you for joining us today. I don't know what it is, maybe because the sun is out, but it is exceptional that we have Dr. Alison Gopnik here today to talk with us. Curious Children, Wise Elders, How Childhood and Elderhood Shape Intelligence and Learning. So on behalf of our magnificent parenting media partners across the country, it's truly our collective business and passion to help build inclusive, safe, and educated communities for our families. And we as publishers are laser focused on how to better serve families, and being the parents and publishers that we are, we really never settle for the status quo. So before we kick off our learning with Alison, there's a few housekeeping items. The webinar today is being recorded so that it can be republished for educational and promotional usage, and everyone who registered busy parents will get a copy of the link if you have to come and go, so that you have it to use later. We also, the format for today's talk is a Q&A throughout, but if during the course of our conversation you have a question, just use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to add that into the conversation. We're really excited to be giving away a SNOO bassinet. If you don't know what it is, Google SNOO. It's really, I don't say this lightly, life-saving help for young parents with new babies. We're giving one of those away, and thanks to Happiest Baby, we are also giving a $500 gift card. And we have a $100 Amazon gift card. We'll announce all of those at the end of the event. And you have to be in attendance to receive the prize at the end. So stay with us. Again, thank you to Chicago Parent, Metro Parent in Detroit, New Jersey Family, and New York Family. And a special thank you to our presenting sponsor, Seattle Children's Hospital. We couldn't do it without you. And to our gold sponsors, Community of Mindful Parenting, KNKX, PacMed, Washington College Savings Plan, and UCDS Schools. Alison Gopnik is a professor of psychology and an affiliate professor of philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. She is an internationally recognized leader in the study of children's learning and development. She is the author of multiple best-selling titles. I am loving rereading this. The Gardener and the Carpenter, what this new science of child development tells us about the relationship between parents and children. So with that, I want to welcome Alison to our talk.
Great, thank you. So happy to be here.
So Alison, I'm going to start out with, and I feel newly inspired and re-engaged in this content. I've been a publisher in this space for multiple decades, but now as a grandparent, I really look at this with a whole different eye to the importance of this work. So can you start our conversation really by talking about these two critical ages and stages of life and childhood and elderhood, and the roles played by these different age groups that help humans flourish?
Yeah. Well, I think, to be perhaps slightly unfair, a lot of people, a lot of psychologists and so forth would sort of think that the pinnacle of human intelligence and achievement was sort of a 35-year-old, usually a 35-year-old psychologist who's writing the book about the pinnacle of intellect and achievement. And then childhood is just kind of building up, and then elderhood is just kind of falling off from that pinnacle. But the new work in biology suggests that that doesn't really make a lot of sense, right? In fact, if you look at our human evolution, one of the most striking things about it is that we have this extremely long period of childhood, twice as long as any other animal that we know of. And then we have this other really strange thing, which is we have this extra 20 years at the end of life, postmenopausal grandmotherhood, which again is very unusual. Unlike any other species we know of, except orcas, and I'll get back to the orcas. I'll get back to the orcas in a minute. So from an evolutionary perspective, that 35-year-old is just one stage in human development, just one stage in what biologists call our life history. And that raises the question about what's happening in that long early period and that long later period, that extra 20 years. If you look at chimps, for example, by the time a chimp is 7 years old, he's producing as much food as he's consuming. So they're already pretty independent. Even in forager hunter-gatherer societies, humans aren't doing that until at least 15. And, my son is 35, in fact. And, we're still writing tuition checks and supporting them. So that's kind of weird. Like, what's happening in that long time when we have to invest so much time and energy into just taking care of those children? And then we have the other weird thing, which is these postmenopausal grandmothers. So 20 years after we're not reproducing anymore, we're still vibrant and involved and engaged. And again, even if you look at forager or hunter-gatherer cultures, it looks like we always have been. So when you talk about life expectancy, that reflects the fact that many in the past, many people were dying when they were children. But there've always been 75, 80-year-olds out there in the world as humans. So that's a big puzzle. Why do we get these two developments? And the idea that I've had and that other people other scientists are increasingly arguing for is that they're actually kind of complementary to each other. So that long childhood lets human beings explore and create and find out about the world around them. And many of the things that we see that are characteristically childlike are these abilities to explore. That's something that I talked about a lot in my earlier books and earlier work. My first book was called The Scientist in the Crib. And we have lots of evidence that kids are like just incredibly motivated little scientists. But of course, during that time when they're being scientists, somebody has to be giving them the research grants, right? Somebody has to be taking care of them so they can do all of that science. And it looks as if elders, grandmothers, but also grandparents, grandfathers, and just all the elders in the community are serving a really, really important function that way, because they're helping to keep those children alive. It turns out that in some forager cultures, for example, the health of like a 3-month-old really depends on the health of the mother, but the health of a 2-year-old really depends on the grandmother. So the grandmothers are coming in and especially taking over for those toddlers and preschoolers. And there's one more piece to this, which is that goes back to the fact that, as I mentioned, among the very few other creatures that have postmenopausal grandmothers are orcas. Okay, why orcas? What do orcas and humans have in common? And the answer seems to be something about culture. So those elders, those grandmothers are, going out and digging for roots and making peanut butter sandwiches and, helping to just keep the kids going. But they're also doing something else that's very important, which is that they're passing on all the information and wisdom that they've accumulated in the past. And again, humans are very unusual in that we rely much more on that kind of culture. We rely much more on that information from past generations than any other creature does. And a number of psychologists have suggested that's really the secret to our success, is that we're always, as Newton said, we're always standing on the shoulders of others. And there's some really beautiful recent work which suggests that it's really elders again, grandmothers, but also grandfathers and just elders in the community who are passing on that cultural information to those young explorers and learners. And it's this kind of symbiosis between the elders who know a lot, have learned a lot, have a lot of experience, and can pass it on to the children, and the children who are just, desperately motivated to learn. That seems to be really the secret to our human intelligence and success. And it turns out that the orcas are one of the few other animals that also has cultural traditions, that also passes on information about what sorts of things. I like the fact that the crucial thing that comes out from the science is the two things that are really culturally important that grandmothers and elders do really well are recipes and songs. So those orcas are passing on information about, yeah, look, the krill is really good over here. And if you just go and get these salmon and they don't quite say, cook them in a soup for this long, but kind of like that. That's the kind of information that's the information that they're passing on. And that feels very accurate for all us grandmothers.
Can you dig a little bit into the concept that you've studied and written about, that children aren't just fully formed and developed adults?
Yeah.
There are different forms of Homo sapiens. And one thing I want to just add in to however you go through this conversation, I think there are a lot of people on, that are joining us today who don't have their parents or their in-laws in the neighborhood or nearby, and they're distant. So that's, how do we help them develop those relationships when they're maybe distant or with others?
Yeah. Yeah. I think a really important point to make is that although we talk a lot about grandmothers, and the scientists and biologists talk about this, really the category is what the great anthropologist Sarah Hrdy calls alloparents, which means anybody who isn't the biological parent, who particularly the biological mother, but who's involved in taking care of children. And one of the things that, again, is very distinctive about human beings is that, again, for as long as we've been around, ever since we evolved, we've gone beyond just biological parents in taking care of children. So other people in the community, relatives, grandparents, older siblings, they've all, the old line about it's taking a village, it really does take the village. And the elders in this village seem to have this particularly powerful effect. So for this question, let's talk about this now, since I can see that this is something that that people are really interested and concerned about. I think it's got two parts. One of them is, I think there's, fortunately for us nowadays, speaking as a grandma who gets a FaceTime video every morning from her grandson in Montreal, we have technologies that let us have those interactions even long distance. And there's some fascinating evidence, for instance, that as long as there's a live interaction, babies will even do things like learn language or learn information or identify somebody who they're interacting with on a screen and map that onto the real person. I mean, I must say, I was surprised at how much my grandson in Montreal, as soon as I show up on a visit, knows that person is the same as the person he's been FaceTiming with. So that's a nice contribution of technology. But then the other side of that is, and another thing to say in general about caregiving and these caregiving relationships is that they're about quality as much as quantity. So actually just having someone in your life who you're interacting with, who can tell you these stories, give you a sense of the past, be that figure, seems to be something that's really valuable, even if it isn't, the way it is with my other grandchildren, that you see them once a week or they're right there. So that I think is sort of the personal piece. The other piece is that it's not just biological kin. So elders in general can serve this function. And one of the things that I think is not so much about a personal set of decisions as a societal set of decisions is, in our society, we do something extremely peculiar, which is separate the elders and the adults and the children. So, the children are in school and the parents are, an hour away commute in a office somewhere. And then, the grandparents are in yet another place. And that's very weird from the perspective of human life. And I think one of the things, a very positive thing that's happening at a societal level is people realizing, no, we need to bring those generations together. And there's lots of wonderful examples of how, for example, having places for having elder centers in the same place as childcare centers, so that those children who are in childcare can have the advantage of the elders, and vice versa, is incredibly productive and good for both groups. And something that I've talked about and a number of people have thought about, for instance, as we get finally get universal childcare in a universal preschool in California, we need trained preschool teachers for that. But why not have a grandmother in every classroom? Not a biological grandmother, but somebody out in the community who just would love to spend some time with a particular group of children, and who doesn't have to be a teacher. They could just be the, designated elder for that group of children. So I think we're there's a lot of more imaginative things we could do as a society that could really help to make that bridge.
I love it. I'm curious if there's a society that you look towards and say, like, they've got it, maybe not perfect, but something to model, our elder child engagement in a more
Right.
consistent way.
Yeah, it's tricky because, of course, it's not. There's a reason why this has happened, which is as societies become modern, as they become more mobile, as people can move around, all of which are really good things. It across societies, it kind of undermines one of the downsides of that, which is otherwise a good thing, is that those close relationships end up being much harder to maintain. And we're not going to go back to being hunter gatherers um, in a village, but I think the challenge is to try and figure out ways in a modern context that we could do that. And it's interesting, even some of what's happened after COVID. One of the things that's happened is that there were a lot more people moving into intergenerational housing, just because you needed to take care of people and because you couldn't go into the office. And a lot of people just staying there. A lot of people discovered, oh no, actually having my parents there to help with the kids was really good. And we could, I think one of the things that's a very hopeful thought as we change our attitude towards housing, that's one of the big places where things are changing. The idea that we could have multi-generational families is really going to be a great advance in the future. And again, maybe that's a biological grandmother, but maybe it's someone who you're close to, who you're not related to, but who can serve that elder kind of function.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting talking about, the changes in society because of, the silver linings of plenty of negatives, but the silver linings of the pandemic and now the endemic. So I'm curious, how has the pandemic and the childcare crisis really highlighted some of our failings to protect our most vulnerable children and elders? And looking to you for sort of what can we do?
Yeah.
I think we have a population of highly motivated and intelligent people that want to see these changes happen. So love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems is that, I started out joking about the 35-year-olds, but it is true that even though from a scientific perspective, the children and the elders are the ones who are doing this incredibly important, fundamental, vital human work, they're kind of invisible, right? So, me singing songs from the 1930s to my grandson doesn't show up in the GDP anywhere. And even just, caring for children doesn't really show up in the GDP. It's for a long time, that incredibly important work has just been sort of been invisible. Nobody was paying any attention to it. And it's only, I think, when we have something like the crisis of the last few years that people realize, although of course they should have been doing it all along, oh no, wait a minute, this is crucial. This is one of the most important things in our society. But our usual sort of politics and economics isn't very good at dealing with it, isn't very good at supporting it. So if you're thinking, like an economist about, okay, well, people are trading things off and they're selling things to each other and they're trying to, get a contract, that just isn't the right description for how we take care of our children or how we take care of our elders, even though morally that seems like the most important thing that we can possibly do. So I think a big thing would be if we just paid more attention. And in particular, if, people like politicians and economists and people in government paid more attention to this, I think that would be like the first, and us individuals too, that would be a first start. One thing that has really struck me, so now I have my older parents who are just coming to visit in California, and it's one of those things where everybody feels like this is just my personal problem. I can't
Mm.
find childcare. My parents are getting old. I don't know what I'm going to do with them. Where are they going to be? I don't want them to be in a, I don't want them to be warehouse somewhere, but I don't think I can take care of them. All of us feel like, yeah, this is like my personal problem, but everybody has that problem when you ask. Everybody that is facing those kinds of issues. So somehow we have to leverage that to make it be a society-wide question.
Yeah. The sandwich generation forever, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of questions around distant grandparents and working full time, and how people, I think, are looking for answers on how to connect, how to be more fluid, not just with technology. I mean, I'm stumped by this question because one, it's very personal and, what you're able to do. But I think, I'm not answering this. You
Yeah.
will, but one of, my son's parents live in Portland, and from the day these kids were, basically born and in a bathtub, bath time every night. And, of course, it's a technology answer, but like you said, there is absolute connectivity from the consistency. My son's mother happens to be musical and sings, and they're really, I think, this is where technology can be horrific on many levels. It is absolutely a huge gift. And I think, the question is about, no technology and not occasional. It's like, what do you do with your kids every day that you could invite an elder or grandparents into?
Right. Yeah. And I think part of it is thinking about other people that other people in the community, other people who are in your network who could be involved, often want to be involved and engaged with children and don't have a chance. But I think an important thing from the scientific perspective is that we're realizing more and more is that the relationship with elders is in many ways quite different from the relationship with parents. So, it's funny that you mentioned about your about being musical and singing. I am not musical at all. I can't barely croak a tune, but I discovered that when I was talking to my 2-year-old grandson when I was in Montreal, I kept singing him show tunes. And he loves that. And now he gets on the video, and the first thing he says is, Grandma, lullaby of Broadway, lullaby of Broadway. And it's just like a sort of automatic thing to do. But it turns out that kind of passing on the songs and stories, especially the songs and stories from the past, is something that elders seem to be really, really naturally designed to do. There's a lovely study by an anthropologist, Michael Gervin, who discovered that if you look in cultures where they're passing on the myths, the ideas, the big ideas in their culture, of things like the songs and the stories and the myths, you learn those from elders more than you learn things from parents. And, as we all know, parents are mostly trying to put out fires, and, and we try as parents to pass on what we know from the past, but we're also having to get resources and figure out how to put food on the table and do all of those things. And the grandparents really can serve that role. And often grandparents, and again, Michael Gervin, the anthropologist, points this out, the grandparents can really be a kind of resource for children because they do things differently. They have different ideas. They have different knowledge. They come from a different place. And I think sometimes there's some tension between parents and grandparents because the parents are seeing, that the grandparents do things differently, have different values, or are engaged with the children differently. But I think all the evidence we have from the science suggests that for children, figuring out, oh, okay, these people, in the context obviously of love and warmth and nurture and safety, that figuring out, oh, these people are a little different. They're even just, their accent is different. The words they use are different. That's a really valuable thing for children. That's a really valuable thing for children to have.
No, and one of the things, I'm the same as you, like, I mean, it's unbelievable how I can't get a tune out. I should be singing every week and can't. But it's such a magical and unique time in infant brain development.
Right.
And I laugh at the way my grandson reads a book, Gaston, his French accent. I'm like, where'd that come from? And that the ability, like, whether your family is, in Japan, China, France, Germany, like, that is such a moment where they're sponges to absorb, what you bring to them in that way.
Yeah, that actually gets back to what the question you asked, which I didn't mention, Elaine, which is in some ways this really central thing that my collaborators and colleagues and I are working on, which is on the other side. So that's all the stuff about the elders. When we look at the children, every week we discover more about just how much they're learning, and many of the things that might seem like bugs from the perspective of childhood turn out to really be features for the kind of work, the kind of learning and exploration that children are doing. So the fact that children are noisy, the fact that they do a lot of different things, the fact that they're active and impulsive, those are all things that are costs from the perspective of being a grown-up. And you want children to grow up to be controlled, focused grown-ups. But those are actually benefits from the perspective of just learning as much as you possibly can about everything that's going on around you. And we've actually been collaborating with people in artificial intelligence who are trying to design intelligent systems. And one of the real morals that comes out of that is that you need to give any kind of system a period to just explore, just figure things out, just learn before it gets to the point of, now I'm going to accomplish my goals and I'm going to do all the things that I need to do later on. And childhood seems to be that period for humans. And I think it explains a lot of the weird things about children, the strange things they say, the fact that, it takes you half an hour to get them to preschool because they get distracted by trying to figure out, like, what's that little piece of dust on the ground? What's that all about? Even things like their attention and memory. And there's some beautiful recent neuroscience studies that show that literally children are taking in more information than their brains are taking in more information than grownups who are put in the same situation. And I think, that it can still be obviously challenging and frustrating to be a parent, but I think if you can just take a second and say, I'm watching this amazing, this amazing miracle of the children learning as much as they do. And just, again, this is something that is a great privilege of being a grandparent, is that you can sit and just watch how many experiments is, Thalo doing in the course of, Thalo's my Montreal grandson, in the course of 5 minutes. Or again, very relevant for a Montreal grandson, that's something you mentioned. How's he learning French and English at the same time, right? So that one of the things that we've discovered is just how amazing those childlike abilities are. And it's not that somebody's going in and giving them special tuition or teaching them or putting them in a school. One of the things that I say is that, you don't have to get children to learn, you just have to let them learn. Someone in the chat mentioned curiosity. It's funny, I was literally just before I came on here, was having a correspondence with a very high-powered computer scientist who was saying, look, could you send me some references about children? Because we're trying to get, the problem with our computers is that they are not curious. They'll do what we tell them to do, but they won't do anything else. And how is it that the kids manage to be as curious as they are?
Good point. One of the things that you're pointing out, I think, and this so speaks to, I experience this myself, which is, I always say to my staff, I seem to get older, they get younger, is, you'll survive your 30s. And
Mhm.
like, this is the moment where, you have little kids, you are working at your hardest to, develop professionally, and, life could not be more busy and chaotic. And how much brain capacity and patience you have is so different than us,
Yeah.
because we have the ability at this age and stage in our life, as do many, many elders, whether it's a grandparent or not, to be, if you're able to help out and take kids to preschool and let them wander and journey off, because you're not having to get to that 9
Right.
o'clock meeting or so. And you also see how quickly it goes, and you have, you're more of an observer than you are, a task driven, in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually some really lovely experiments that show that we do, and somewhat surprisingly in a way, I mean, we do genuinely get more altruistic pretty clearly and happier as we transition from that stage of adulthood, which you just described so vividly, to this elder stage, even though we're getting creaky and ugly and bent over, we seem to actually, people seem to actually get happier. And I think part of the reason for that is, if you think again about the 35-year-olds, I think about my own children, um, the way the world works, and this is a good thing, the way your brain works when you're 35, is that you're setting yourself goals, you see how far away you are from the goals, you take a bunch of actions to achieve the goals, and then you get that goal, and then you set yourself another goal because you've already achieved that goal. And that seems to be very much the structure of the way your brain works when you're around 35.
Yeah.
And that means you get a lot done. You need to have that kind of thinking to be able to accomplish as much as you can. But it also means that you're caught in what psychologists sometimes call a hedonic treadmill. It's like you're always trying to get to the next thing. And it looks as if children and grandparents, and I think this is part of the reason, children and elders, I think this is part of the reason why we have a certain bond. We get released from that hedonic treadmill. We're not anymore thinking about, how am I going to do? Am I going to get the next promotion? Am I going to, get tenure or not? Or find the right mate? Or all those kinds of things that are so important for adulthood. We're kind of released from that to be in this niche of care and teaching. We're in this niche of, let me tell you the things that I've found out in my life. Let me pass things on to the next generation. And in some ways, that's each of the stages of our life has its own glories and its own downfalls. But I think it's a pretty nice place to be. There's another anthropological story that I really love, which is there was an anthropologist named Polly Wiesner who looked at the Kung people in Africa. And what she did was she just recorded all the conversations between more than 4 people during the entire day for a year. So just write down, what are people saying, what's happening. And what she discovered was that during the day, a lot of the conversation was being done by the adults who were going out and doing the work that they needed to do and trying to coordinate it, and often fighting over it, and so forth. But at night, when it got dark and when everyone was sitting around the fire, suddenly it switched to the elders and the children. So now the elders were sitting around the fire and telling the big stories about how the world works and what the mythology is, things that are happening far in the past or far away. And I think everybody's known, again, grandmothers or not, children just loved hearing stories about what it was like when, my husband was growing up on the farm in New Mexico, 70 years ago. And even if you're not thinking about childhood, just think about your relationships with, say, your students or with people you're taking care of otherwise. That's a really sad, there's something really satisfying about being able to say, yeah, well, look, here's what happened a long, long time ago, like 1995. That's something that puts you in a really different kind of place. And
I-
for those 35-year-olds, thinking about that, those elders as a resource, as something that you can rely on, something that you can call on, I think is also something that's really important. Again, in our culture, we so often think about it's just individuals, and there was another study that came out recently that turns out that people really like to be asked to help. And it's sort of amazing. People, it was a very systematic study that showed that people want to help more than the people who are asking them for help think. The people who are asking for help are sort of saying, I don't want to be a burden. People are going to react negatively. And almost always it's the other way around, that people are actually happier, more satisfied in helping. And we need to figure out we need to figure out some way of making that happen.
Because most of our audience is probably like half our age. I'm going to tell a funny little anecdote. I have an identical twin sister, and we were playing in our backyard back in Skokie, Illinois. And our neighbor came over and she was like super happy. And we were, like, what's up with Sylvia? And it was her birthday. And when we asked her how old she is going to be, she said, I think she said 49 and we looked at her like, what's she happy about? She's like almost dead. And it was like, now we get it, because it is such an extraordinary and thankful time to be able to like give back and be calmer, and you're not chasing, like you said, that position. So thank you for that. There's somebody wants you to explain this statement. A new baby's captivated gaze at her mother's face lays the foundations for love and morality.
Yeah, this is really interesting. And this is one of the things we have a big project at the Center for Advanced Studies in Stanford now about caregiving. And I think it's a pretty good argument to be made that some of these really basic emotions that come up in caregiving relationships, when you're taking care of someone who's helpless, whether it's a baby or an elder or someone who's ill or whatever, that those are arguably at the heart of a lot of what we think of as morality. So that feeling of, and if you think about it, it is pretty amazing and profound, right? I mean, that baby isn't going to do anything for you in the immediate future or even in the far future. And it isn't just that the baby has your genes. Anytime you take care of somebody who's helpless, that you get that kind of sense. And what is it about that? One of my slogans is that it's not that we care for people because we love them. We love them because we care for them. I recently had this experience where my husband, who's 79, had major heart surgery that he had to have, which thankfully all worked out fine, and he's fine now. I've never had anyone that I was close to really being sick or having to be taken care of. Hadn't understood how much the reaction was a reaction of making me love him more, not love him less. And I think that's a really important thing that we kind of underestimate, is how much just the act of caring is itself something that is kind of at the root of a lot of our deep moral emotions. Another way I put it sometimes is, it might seem like, I think parents and grandparents have this experience where, you're talking about how wonderful and amazing your child is, and everybody else is sort of rolling their eyes and saying, oh yeah, well, that's grandmother has always said that. But I think you can make the argument the other way around. I think you could say the only time you really realize how marvelous each individual person is when you're a parent, or maybe even more when you're a bubba. I think we're the only people who really get it about how amazing human beings are. Now, it happens to be our little, Augie or Thalo or whatever, but I think the mistake is the fact that most of the time we don't realize how valuable and important and marvelous and wonderful the people around us are, especially the children around us. Like, it would be hard to love everybody the way you love your grandchild, but I think when you do, you're really getting, I think that's the more accurate picture of what the world is like and what our values are like. It's not that that's the kind of hallucination that's the result of being a grandmother.
No, I think it, I watched a documentary that we're considering screening on gratitude, where, people that, like Christine Carter and Jack Kornfeld are all in this. And it's like the science behind what comes with that. And, how you look at another little friend of your grandson's, in a different way because of that relationship. I'm going to kind of switch topics. So this is
Yeah.
a question on neurodiversity. So the question is regarding our neurodiverse kids, such as autistic, ADHD, learning disability, kids who have different needs also need a lot more patience and understanding due to communication differences, external behaviors. How do you suggest working with elders who are struggling to understand like this child's needs and, tend to be more punitive or short? What
Yeah.
are maybe, and some advice and some resources and some insights?
Yeah, this is not my, this is not my bailiwick. So I think there certainly are there's a big community of people who are working on those issues. But again, I think, I don't want to suggest that all elders, just by virtue of being like over 60, are marvelous caregivers any more than all parents are marvelous caregivers. It's caregiving something you have to learn and you have to appreciate and you have to see. But I do think, again, and I think the neurodiversity example is a good one, the more you actually see and interact with people, the more you understand them, the more you're able to care for them. So the sort of the new visibility of the range of human capacities, I think by itself is making a big difference.
Yeah. This is a question, it looks like a reader of the Philosophical Baby. You show through a lot of experiments and research that there's a way in which children are a lot smarter than adults. You hit on this. I think that's the right way to say it. In a way, their strangest, silliest behaviors and how we kind of optimize those moments rather than quash them.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's, as I say, it's been fascinating for me in the last little while to see this angle from, say, people who are making robots or computers, right? You wouldn't think that was something that had much to do with kids. But it turns out that, for instance, if you want a robot, even just a robot that's robust enough to do things like, fold laundry or sort nails, giving that robot a childhood is a really good way of doing that. Your model is more what children are doing, the kind of intelligence, the kind of learning, the kind of exploration that you see, than what grownups are doing. And again, I mean, it's important to say part of childhood is learning to be an adult. So children do have to develop executive control and executive function and learn how to focus their attention, learn how to ignore distractions, learn how to plan, have long-term planning. Those are all really important things. And especially the school age period is a period when all of that is actually happening. But there's a joke that the great psychologist Jean Piaget always used to say, that when he went to talk to American audiences, they would have what he'd call the question américaine. He went out all the way around the world talking to people. And the question américaine was always, how can we get them to do it faster? So he'd talk about all the great things that children were doing. And then the Americans would say, okay, we want to speed this up. But actually, there's really fascinating recent work. There was just a paper in Nature Human Behavior. And I've written an essay about this from the Wall Street Journal that shows that actually adverse experiences early on in life seem to be more likely to make kids grow up too fast than to slow them down. So accelerating development isn't necessarily a good thing. In fact, I think there's some evidence that accelerating it too much can be a negative thing. So it's important for children to grow up to be adults, but we don't want them to grow up to be adults faster. That's not the right way of thinking about it.
This is a really great question. How do you forgive yourself for mothering mistakes?
Well, I think a good way
And
of
she
thinking,
added when you have grandchildren, but
right,
I think it's
just general, right? Yeah. So, in the Gardener and the Carpenter, I talked about this some, and one of the things I think is thinking about your relationship to children as being like your other kinds of close relationships. So one of the things that I talk about in that book is that the very word parenting is a very recent invention. It's only been around for a short period of time, although people have been parents forever. And it's funny that we don't talk about, husbanding our husbands or
Mhm.
childing our parents. That what we say is, well, look, I'm in this relationship with my husband. And that doesn't mean that we don't make mistakes or we don't feel bad about them, but that's part of just what happens in a relationship. You get a particular child with particular strengths and weaknesses, and you're a particular grown up with particular strengths and weaknesses, and you forge a relationship. And sometimes it goes well and sometimes it's difficult. But I don't, I think you'd rather love and make mistakes than not love. It part of being a grown up out in the world is being willing to take a leap into these deep relationships that you're never going to be able to perfect or even achieve a particular standard about, but just just be in those relationships with those children.
This wouldn't be you or me, Allison, but there's a question around how do you deal with grandparents that are a little bit too tough, not listening. They're, like kind of more disciplinary than the parent really feels comfortable with.
Mhm.
And that, like there's just a conflict, like, the parent feels like you're quashing self-expression, like we were talking about, and curiosity versus, teaching some beneficial lessons about behavior.
Yeah. As I said before, I mean, there's two interesting things about this. One of them is, again, I highly recommend Sarah Hrdy, the anthropologist's book, Mothers and Others, which is about this allo parenting idea. Um,
Mhm.
and she has a really interesting argument, which is that part of the reason why humans learn to be so cooperative, which is, again, one of the really distinctive things about us, we have these webs of cooperation, is because we had to raise children together. So actually, this allo parenting about, trying to persuade other people to help take
Mhm.
care of your child and vice versa, taking care of other people's children, that's really challenging human social interaction. And, not surprisingly, maybe for years, psychologists talked about hunting as being the great source of human cooperation. Was, oh, the guys get together and they have to hunt, and then they have to have different roles, and they have to coordinate. And Sarah points out that's nothing compared to trying to take care of children together. That's the thing that's really the challenging job, where you have to coordinate and figure out how to get people on the same page. And I think that's kind of a nice model for thinking about what's happening with grandparents. It's not, think about it as if you were if you think about what happens when you've got a big cooperative problem at work, right? Where everybody's a bit different. They have different ways of approaching it. And you have to figure out, how do I cooperate and coordinate so that we're all on the same page? And I do think one thing that is perhaps comforting is that I think the evidence is pretty clear that children are good at sort of sorting out, oh, here's how these people function. Here's how these people work. Here's what happens at grandma's house that's different from what's happening at mom's house. And, they're pretty good at having a sense of, oh, these are the rules here, and here, these are the rules somewhere else. It's not like they get confused or don't understand about that. And again, in the context of loving close relationships.
I mean, this is a great segue to this question. How do I establish a relationship where my children see me as their mother and not as their friend? I'm having a hard time balancing that.
Yeah. Um, well, I think caregiver is the right way to think about it, right? Is you're someone who is caring for someone who's caring for someone else, and that's a very broad thing that we do lots of times with lots of people. Um, so I think maybe uh, there's a quote that I love from the poet Robert Haas. I can't produce this; it's poetry right off the top of my head, but he says, when a poet uses the word mother in a poem, he's actually talking about some woman in her 30s who's trying to raise children. um, and there's something about that word, the word mother, that is kind of overwhelming. Whereas I think if you think of it as I'm a person working with a bunch of other people and caring for them and trying to take care of them, people who are particularly helpless. That's a better way of thinking about it.
So we're going to pause for 1 second so Brenna can pop up a survey so we can kind of know where people are coming from. And I will then move on to another question while she is doing that. So this is from someone in Seattle saying, my parents live in Asia. I do my best to try to build a bond, but it feels like my kids are growing at a faster pace and the grandparents are finding it hard to cope with them. Differences in language, distance. I mean, I feel like we kind of covered this, but
yeah, I think, I mean, I think we just would say that the things that we've said before, it's coordinating a lot. I mean, even though having more than just one caregiver is really important and even essential for what's going on with children, coordinating that can be difficult and can be challenging. And it, as I say, it isn't necessarily biological grandparents that we're talking about. It could be someone in the preschool or a teacher or a babysitter or other people in the community who can serve this kind of elder function.
yeah, and I mean, I think we've had some really good, you've given good insights on, use those things that you see as a deficit, whether it's language or, to build a bridge, because kids are more curious and interested than we give them credit for. And, like to embrace it and give it a try seems
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things, go back to those orcas. I mean, part of the reason why the orca grandmothers lead the pod when things get rough is because they know about a wider range of experiences. And as I say, children just love listening to stories about those grandparent stories about what things were like when they were children, even if it's very, very, I mean, especially if it's very different from the way that the children are living now. So,
Yeah,
hearing
yeah.
about the wood stove and going out to the farm, those are things that the kids are really fascinated by. So I think your point is exactly right, Elaine. Thinking about the differences aren't necessarily a bad thing. This can really be a benefit.
So one of the richer experiences that elders bring is, kind of, it's also a failing of parents. I think as parents, we tend not to make ourselves vulnerable to our kids, see us as successful, or we don't expose our failures. And this question is around what elders can bring as far as grief and loss. To what does the research tell us about sharing these kinds of experiences with children?
Yeah, well, we know that children, by the time children are about 6 or 7, and in fact, often around 6 or 7, children start understanding the biological concept of death. And that's a really important discovery and understanding. And as you can imagine, it's often quite upsetting for children. And it's not infrequent that it's in the context of someone who's an elder, who's close to them. And I think, as usual with children, talking through it, giving them information, letting them talk through what they're thinking is the best way of handling those kinds of things. And children are thinking about grief and loss, even whether we want to talk about it with them or not. And talking about it with them is really a good way of helping them to understand the things that they'll need as an adult.
So this is just a practical question to kind of end on, because people are like trying to take in all of the studies and research and articles and references that you've made. Maybe we could certainly watch this again and review it and share those names and titles. But if you're willing to share even the article that you recently wrote that you were referencing.
Yeah, that's right. What I can do is I'll put, I can send the piece an article I just wrote about caregiving, and a couple of others, the one about adverse experiences and something about the elders as well. And I'll put those, I can send them to you and you can circulate them. That would be
And I have to make a pitch for Ezra Klein's interview with you, which was just fantastic. And I'd send our audience for even more great depth there. So before we sign off, I just want to say the SNU bassinet winner is Dorothy Pulio, lucky. And the $500 gift card winner is Jennifer Abenat, and Stacy Barton won the Amazon card. So Alison, thank you so much for spending time with us, and really enjoyed our conversation, and to our media sponsors. And we hope that this is a hot topic always for now 15 years, that you join us for our next topic, Raising Critical Thinkers, Media Literacy for the Digital Age, with author Julie Bogart. And she also happens to be a homeschooling guru, so she's got a lot of interesting perspectives. So with that, I just want to say thank you and have a great afternoon.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you all for your great questions.
Thank you.